The book of Psalms is one of the most beloved books in the Bible. It's been treasured for centuries by saints who have gone to it for comfort, for hope. What makes the book of Psalms so unique is that it provides us a place where we can identify poetically with someone else who's expressing their heart emotions in such a beautiful way. That's what is wonderful about the book of Psalms. And that's one of the first among 8 things I want to share with you about this book, kind of as an introduction to the book of Psalms. 150 Psalms, it's by far the longest book of the Bible, but it is different in that it is actually a song book. Some have called this God's hymnal. It's a collection of songs that are meant to be sung. And we read them. You need to read them thinking poetic. Read them thinking, this is a song. You're reading the lyrics to a song. Second thing I want you to think about in regard to this book is simply this. The Psalms have numerous authors. David is the most prolific of the psalm writers. He wrote exactly one half of these psalms. There's 150. He wrote 75 of them. So that we often refer to the Psalms of David, but he did write half of them, but he didn't write all of them. There are 8 named authors in the book of Psalms, including David. David being the most prolific, but interestingly enough, and surprising to many, not the most famous. That might be a shock to you, but the most famous of the psalm writers, actually, Moses wrote Psalm 90. He wrote one of the Psalms, Psalm 90. Moses, I believe, the most famous person in the Old Testament, with Abraham and David being a close second or third, or maybe tied for second or whatever. But some were written by the sons of Korah, so maybe some young men sat around and wrote songs, collaborated to write some of these psalms together. The third thing you need to know about these psalms is they have headings, which gives us some insights into what the circumstances were for some of these psalms. Not all of them, but some of the psalms have a description. For example, perhaps the most famous of which is Psalm 51. In Psalm 51, we have a little descriptive header referring to that this psalm was written soon after, or right around the time when Nathan the prophet confronted David for his sin of adultery with Bathsheba. And so if you'll go into the other parts of the Bible to read about that story and then come back to Psalm 51, it really provides the context, the background behind this psalm, and then you'll read it with a greater understanding of where David was coming from and why he was confessing in the way he was confessing. Third thing I would share with you about the book of Psalms is that we have to read them with the recognition that there's different types of psalms. You have psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of celebration, psalms of praise, psalms of confession. They're what are called enthronement psalms, lament psalms, pilgrimage psalms, also known as songs of ascent, where they're traveling to Jerusalem to worship, and they're singing these songs on the way. Royal psalms, wisdom psalms, and most notorious of all, what we call imprecatory psalms. What's an imprecatory psalm? An imprecatory psalm is when the psalmist is appealing to God for justice, and in the process, he's calling down curses on his enemies. And he's saying some really raw, harsh things about what he wishes God would do, or what would happen to these people that that threaten him or have harmed him. So those are imprecatory psalms, which leads me to another point that we need to make, and that is this. Oftentimes, we recognize that while the Psalms do teach proper doctrine about God and about life and about sin and righteousness, and doctrinally they're sound, there are many times in the Psalms when the psalmist is being raw and honest in his emotions and are saying things that are not doctrinally true about God or life, expressing doubts about God, questioning God's character. You find these type of statements in the Psalms, often like the imprecatory Psalms. You're not loving your enemy, as Jesus told us, but you're hating your enemy, and you're expressing it in that psalm. That doesn't mean that the Bible is endorsing or saying it's okay to do those things. It's just the Psalms are honest expressions of human emotions and human situations where these psalm writers find themselves in these situations. They're being honest with God. They're crying out to God their true feelings, which may or may not be right feelings. They may not be biblically what they need to be doing in that moment, but it's honest. And oftentimes what you'll find in a psalm is it will go from a place of despair or lack of faith or distrust in God or questioning his character. But by the end of the psalm writer has worked his way through the character of God and remembering what God has done. And by the end of the psalm, he's now in the right place and he's expressing correct doctrine. He's expressing the truth about God and life and sin and all that. So also, in thinking about introducing the book of Psalms, you do need to know you're going to come across a word that's probably not in your working vocabulary, and that word is Salah. S-E-L-A-H is how it's usually spelled in your Bible. And you can Google that word and you can find definitions of it, confident definitions. But the truth of the matter is, if we're to be perfectly honest, it's a bit of a mystery word. We honestly do not know for sure what that word means. It's by itself in 71 times in the book of Psalms, and like 39 different Psalms you find Salah. Our best guess, this is true, anybody who's acting like they're confident this is what it means, they're really presenting an educated guess. And I think it's a quite good educated guess. Our best guess as to what the word Salah means is that it is probably a musical notation for the choir master. These psalms will say to the choir master. In fact, the vast majority of the psalms that have Salah in it also have the little thing to the choir master that he would set it to music or whatever. And so we believe it was probably a musical notation to let the choir master know that this is the place where you need to put a musical interlude. This is a place where you need to have if we're doing it in terms of the 80s, this is where you'd have a saxophone solo or a guitar solo, lead guitar solo, electric guitar solo, something like that. So that's what we think it means. It's a time to just not go on immediately with reading more or singing more, in the case of the Psalms, but to just think and reflect. And so that's where you often see the definition for Salah is think and reflect. Because there's so many different types of Psalms, it's important that you think about what type of Psalm you're in, and it helps you to interpret it. But you need to recognize that they're not necessarily structured. Oftentimes the different type of Psalms are grouped together, but sometimes they're not. And so there's been many who have tried to put a structure on the book of Psalms. The most notable structure is that at some point in time, probably in the era of Ezra, the priest, a few centuries before Christ, when these Psalms were collected, they decided because there's so many of them, to put them into 5 different books. Book 1 is Psalms 1 through 41. Book 2, Psalms 42 through 72. Book 3, 73 through 89. Book 4, 90 through 106. And Book 5, finally, Psalms 107 to 150. Not quite sure fully why these are divided that way. Some think that there's some structure that you can see in those Psalms that point to something. And there's been attempts made to do that, but we're not real clear on that. And it's kind of dangerous if you put too much of a grid on that, in my personal opinion. So, finally, and most importantly, the thing you need to know about the Psalms is that they are Christological. We find Jesus, the Christ, in the Psalms. Psalm 2, for example, talks about the Lord and his anointed. Who's his anointed? Talking about Jesus. Now, David, who wrote the Psalm, might have been thinking of himself, but when we read it now through the eyes of the New Testament, the New Covenant, it's clearly talking about Christ. Someone once said, I heard a pastor say years ago, that you'll find Jesus Christ in every psalm. And at first I thought, no, come on now. I don't know if you find Jesus in every single psalm. But then I was reminded of Luke chapter 24, where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, is walking on the road to Emmaus with 2 of his followers. And it says that he took them through the scriptures and showed them how in all the scriptures there is this messianic expectation. All the scriptures are writing of things concerning himself about Jesus. And I've noticed through the years, the more I read the Psalms, the more I meditate on them, the more I spend time in them, the more I see Jesus as well. So that's an overview introduction of the Psalms. There could be a lot more that's said, but I think that's a good place to start if you're going to be reading the Psalms and benefiting from it. And I encourage you to do that. You'll be blessed.